Here's something about the Alpha system that doesn't get nearly enough love. But to convince you to get on board the love train, Minolta lover Dan is here to explain.
Pro photographer, you never used Minolta, obviously, because it's either Nikon or Canon, right?
Yeah.
So why didn't pro photographers use Minolta?
That's a really good question. I think because they weren't as trusted, and they were, and initially when they brought all these out, they started with the 7000, and the 9000 was supposed to be their pro body, but people didn't really rate the autofocus, and and then reasonably quickly Nikon and Canon came with their autofocus.
And the rest, as they say, is history. Canon reigned supreme throughout the DSLR days. Sony, fresh from a Minolta takeover, wanted a slice of the DSLR market share, but had to think of other ideas, and decided to end Canon and Nikon's DSLR domination by making cameras with semi-translucent mirrors, to finally eliminating mirrors completely. But Sony's decision to cast the past aside and embrace the future meant some absolute banging lenses have been almost forgotten, but thankfully they're not completely history yet.
That's something perhaps that's kind of a little bit forgotten about, isn't it?
It's totally forgotten about.
There is some fantastic glass.
I mean, there are some Facebook groups, shout out to those Facebook groups, some things. There's a sort of dedicated following. There's a bunch of people who never left.
Well, if you want something with that vintage aesthetic, but you want the convenience of autofocusing, there's not too much choice, is there? I mean,
no.
Of course, if you buy a Sony lens, you're not going to get that. You'll just get the autofocusing. And then they'll talk about sharpness. We've made it sharper. Look at the MTF charts.
I mean, you've got the new Nikon lenses,
yeah,
and that new Canon that you just did, the Canon whatever 45, which are kind of going a little bit back, but they're really not. And part of it is they can't use the elements and the materials that they used in these lenses. But it's the most vintage lens that you can use that still has all the, or most of the bells and whistles, not all, there's some caveats, but for photos, not for video. I wouldn't use it for video. I want to say vintage, I mean 80s, sort of 90s vintage, not 50s, 60s vintage. Then that's better because you've now got a 40-year-old lens with eye control autofocus, all thanks to this adapter. Sony brought out the LAE1 and LAE2, LAE3, LAE4, whatever. They had all these different adapters, and they all to different degrees allowed you to autofocus with these lenses. But it's only really now with the new one, the LAE5, or the current one, that you've finally got the ability to focus properly with these genuinely old lenses.
I like the feel of it moving.
Yeah, it positively feels alive, right?
Because some of the autofocusing is quite clunky, I would say.
For those who don't know, it's all through that little screw there, which is not going to focus.
The face.
Yeah, that little screw there marries with this little screw drive thing. We can do a proper shot. This thing here, and that little thing twiddles. See it twiddling. And that focuses the lens. So there's no motor in that lens. The later series of Sony Alpha ones, some of them did have motors in, but none of these have any motor in the lens. It's purely driven off that little screw.
I wouldn't say that having the AF driven mechanically by the body is a bad thing, it's just noisier.
Love it.
Noise.
It's like some Johnny Five stuff.
Focus is overrated, but these aren't not sharp. They're very sharp. They just perhaps don't resolve as well as the current Sony equivalent. But there's a difference between resolution and sharpness, right? Like if I was shooting architecture, that's different, right? Or if I'm shooting like a sort of super high-end fashion campaign and it's going to go on a billboard in Times Square, okay. But even then, you make the stylistic choice to not have like super high resolving images. Like you've got to have made the choice to go out there. Like I'm making a positive choice when I take these out to go and shoot in a certain way to try and get a certain result. And if I take a modern Sony lens, it's normally for a different reason. Like I'm more concerned about like nailing focus. It's like I'm vlogging or whatever. Then that's when you choose a Sony lens. But I love these. I think they give a really nice result.
They might not have the obvious vintage aesthetic of much older lenses, but there's a certain smoothness that comes from the spherical optical designs.
The whole thing with Cooke lenses is not about resolution. Yeah, they resolve in the middle, but they're not quoting you like resolution numbers like crazy. They're looking for softness and fall off. You've got the mid zone, which is the bit in transition between here and there. So if something's there, what does that look like? What does it look like here? How does it make your face look? in a frame, those are things that cinematographers care massively about, you know, and that they tend not to. And again, it depends on the kind of, the cinematographer, the style of thing they're shooting, but they tend, in general, not to care so much about the edges, or if they do have the edges, they actually want it to even vignette slightly or be slightly softer. Yeah. You know, all modern lenses, all the Sony lenses, they're all flat field. Everything is flat. Yeah. Everything, all the rays of light when coming through the lens, you know, they're trying to line up red, greens, and blues to everything to be flat on the sensor plane. You know, this will give you a different look in other ways. You know, a warmer coating. You know, that lack of a flat field maybe. Flaring, you know, you're going to see lots of different flares. These flare mostly blue, I would say.
The coating on these old lenses.
Now, in the cases of those lenses, maybe it wasn't deliberate when they first made them, but we've got used to them looking, inverted commas, nice.
You know, things like flaring, having flaring, not having it, is sort of underrated in photography.
In Cine, people just get very excited. We met Marcus, who's got his entire Cine Flares website, and he's basically mapped out just about every lens, Cine lens, for flaring.
Incredible.
I do think it's underrated in photography. If I was shooting a professional job, I would be worried about flare messing up and going across the face at the wrong time, and that's probably when I'm going to be shooting a Sony lens or Canon lens or Nikon lens or whatever. But if I'm out shooting for me or for my own personal work, I kind of like working with flare, and also the randomness. You know, it's a very random thing. You know, you can't really predict it a lot of times. That makes it fun.
Yeah.
And possibly the best bit, they're really quite affordable. The 20mm f2.8 is just a little over £100, and this zoom lens Dan bought for £10 in a charity shop. You could look at third party for autofocusing lenses for less, but this is pretty much first party and a lot more fun.
The big cost, apart from the camera, is the adapter. So once you bought the adapter, everything else kind of becomes affordable.
What stuff should you look out for when buying these lenses? Some of them might be a bit fungusy, right?
Scratches, fungus, obviously look like they've been dropped.
Some of them are quite plasticky, aren't they?
They're all plasticky.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing, but probably why some people don't like them. So most of them are quite affordable relative to the same focal length in a Sony. There's the odd exception, like the 35 1.4, because cinematographers love it so much, and a lot of them convert them to Cine lenses. They, you know, take them out and put them in a metal thing. They've got crazy expensive, but most of the other ones aren't that bad.
One sentence, why should anybody buy this?
Because they have a vintage aesthetic with autofocus, and they aren't that big and heavy. Don't buy it if you care too much about corner-to-corner sharpness, chromatic aberration, for instance, noise, or video.
That is a long sentence. Anyway, just as a little bonus, here's a bit of Minolta Disco Pants funkiness that I wish Sony would bring back.
Perfect pentaprism here. World's worst pentaprism here. But there's something nice about the fact that it is just so but ugly, right? Look at it, it's actually got an Alpha logo.
That is sweet. It's just kind of a shiny pearlescent white. It's not just plain white. I love the screen up there, and it's slightly tilted, slightly angled. I think Sony need a bit of that kind of craziness of old Minolta design. It's gone a bit plain, Sony. You know. We need some of this, Sony. Whip out some of the old Minolta goodness.
It's all white, mate.
It's all white.
It's all white. Okay.
Oh my god. That is amazing. It's kind of weird because when you've got a shop full of really expensive gear, and sometimes it doesn't have to be the most expensive thing that's most exciting.